There is one cleric domain that watches the divide between death and life very closely. I talked to Mike Merles about the grave domain in Xanathar's Guide to Everything.
So one of the things that I always find interesting about Dungeons and Dragons is this idea of the god of death. And you have a god of death and you have the undead. But then you have Orcus, prince of the undead. And then you have necromancers, right? The undead are kind of like, they live this sort of confused life of like, wait, who's actually in charge, right? Is it Orcus? Is it this necromancer? Is it this god? So, and then on top of it, what the grave domain is aimed at is like in Forgotten Realms, you have a deity like Kalimvor, who's more the sentinel of the dead, right? And that really appeals to me in a world where you have this concept of undeath, where someone could go to a local graveyard and animate skeleton zombies, or if someone is a person dies, they could come back as a specter, they could come back as a revenant. There's this interesting thing that boundary between life and death is permeable. And so with the grave domain, it started by when we asked ourselves, like, well, what would the more heroic looking character who was maybe a cleric of someone like Kalimvor or someone like that, or of Osiris, this idea that death is a boundary that boundary must be watched over, right? We don't necessarily want people bouncing back and forth through it, especially the undead specifically, and we don't necessarily want some people going through it from life to death, and we don't necessarily want other people coming through from death to undeath. I think there's kind of a misconception sometimes that this type of cleric wouldn't want people to come back from the dead. It's like, no, that's not it. They just would want to make sure if people are coming back, they're coming back as living creatures, not as the undead. And it's also one of those things where it could very easily just become the anti-undead character. And that's definitely a design path we could have gone down, but that feels very limiting. That style of design is very difficult to make work in Dungeons and Dragons. Not in the sense that you can't just write it down and have it. Like I can just write a subclass that just says you get plus sub whatever against undead. But in play, it's very hard to find a comfortable middle ground between the character who is useless, not useless, but is just clearly not using a bunch of class abilities until the undead show up. Then that character is very powerful. So we didn't want to go that path because we also find it, when we look out at what DMs are running, a lot of DMs like using a lot of undead. So if you have a character who's just really good at just straight up beating down the undead, it makes those adventures harder to run. It's just, it becomes, in my experience at least, becomes a bit of a burden on the Dungeon Master because it's just such a brute force way of making a character better against a very common type of foe. So we wanted the Grave Domain to really focus on this idea of you are the sentinel on death's door, you're helping people go through or come back, and you're preventing the undead from violating that sort of sacred boundary, that undeath is an abomination. And we wanted to do that in a way that, if you look at the domain, you have abilities like I can detect undead, I can sense them. So I'm an undead hunter in a way, but I am not like, oh, now I just get just tons of bonuses against the undead. Trying to find ways for benefits that were more strategic, rather than tactical. A tactical bonus would be like +2 damage. A strategic one is more like, well, I can see through any illusion created by the undead. So I can spot the vampire, but it doesn't help me fight the vampire. I still need to be clever in that way. And that's what we wanted to feel. And then this is one of those things where I like the class little mechanical flourish where you get Spare the Dying and you can use it as a bonus action. Just this idea that if the Cleric of the Grave is with your party, you have a lot less to worry about dying. If you drop, it's much easier for that character just to keep you from going over the edge. Again, coming up with that idea of, if you think of if you look at the Shadow Sorcerer from the book, this sort of character who's comfortable living in the divide between life and death. The Cleric of the Grave is the sort of watches over that divide. Doesn't necessarily live there, but has an eye on it and can navigate it and can sort of be the traffic cop for it. And so that's what it really kind of appeals to me, because I think that idea of the undead and where they fit into the D&D universe and the sort of figures around them, like Orcus, Vecna, and so on, and various gods of death, like Nurl from Greyhawk or whatever, that's always been very interesting to me. And so that this sort of design, it appealed to me, and this like tackling it from that more Kalimvor, guardian of death's threshold angle.
You can find the Cleric Grave Domain in Xanathar's Guide to Everything. That book is available for purchase on dndbeyond.com by following the link in this video description, and you'll earn pre-order bonuses as well. I'm Todd Kenrick. Thanks for watching.